Hello, my name's Audrey Collins and I am the Family History Specialist at the National Archives. I've been researching family history for more than 30 years, and during that time I have used the census more than any other record, and there's a good reason for that. When you're researching your family history, the census is the single most useful record that you will use. It's got everybody in it, at least in theory, and it tells you not just information about the person, but about their family, their neighbours, their surroundings. So you get a lot of context as well as the information about the person. Now, like a lot of record sets that we use, it wasn't taken for our benefit. The British government decided to take a survey of the population and call it a census every 10 years from 1801. And when you're trying to get information about the population as a whole, you want to count everyone. And the best way of ensuring that you count everybody once and nobody twice is to list them all by name. That didn't always work perfectly, but on the whole it did. But nowadays it's family historians who probably use the census more than anybody else. Now, the first census was in 1801, but unfortunately it wasn't until 1841 that all the records were kept centrally and are able to be searched. There was a census every 10 years, except for 1941, because of the Second World War. But because there's a 100-year closure on census records, the most recent one that we can look at is 1911. Now, the way the census was taken was a person called an enumerator went round to every household a few days before census night, which was usually at the end of March, beginning of April. They left a paper with the household, which was called a schedule, and someone in the household, usually the head, was supposed to fill that in and then hand it back to the enumerator when they called back a few days later. So I think of the census as really a bit like walking down the street and peering in through everybody's windows to see who they were with and what they were up to. Now, because it was only taken every 10 years, that tells you where people were and who they were with on that night. It doesn't tell you what they were doing for the other 9 years and 364 days before the next census or since the last one. But mostly people will be at home with their families. Now, the information that's in the census is very useful in itself. In 1841 it was fairly limited. You got a person's name, their age, or at least an approximate age, their occupation, and information about their birthplace, although that was only whether or not they were born in the county where they were being enumerated. From 1851 onwards you get more information. You get relationships within the household, which is very useful, so you can see how people relate to each other within a family. And also their marital status, whether they were single or married or widowed. A bit more detail about occupations, and a birthplace as in a parish and a county of birth, and that can be very useful indeed. When you get to 1911, you get quite a lot more information. Although there have been small increases in information up to 1901, 1911 was a big difference. First of all, because of the way the government collected the information and tabulated it, they used machines for the first time, they were able to ask more questions. And one of the questions, for example, was for married women, how long they'd been married, how many children they had, and how many of those children were still alive and how many had died. You get more detail also about occupations and quite a lot more about birthplaces. For example, if someone was born overseas, were they just visiting, or they settled here, were they naturalised? And for the first time, if someone was born in Scotland or Ireland, you will get their exact place, at least in theory. The other nice thing about the 1911 census is that, again, because of the way it was tabulated, for the first time, the household schedules were kept and they weren't copied up into enumeration books, which is what had happened for all the previous censuses. So there's a good chance that when you look at your family in the 1911 census, you'll actually be seeing your ancestors' own handwriting. So that's very exciting. And also, it's one less stage of copying. So that's roughly what you can expect to see in the census. And the way we get into it now mainly is by searching by name. But you can also search by place. But when you get there, it's a good idea not just to go in and go, oh, lovely, I found my ancestor, record all the information about them, and then move on. You really should stop and just look around for a bit. Look at the rest of their family. Look at their neighbours. See what sort of occupations they did. See whether your family was living, for example, it might show you whether they were living next door to the pub or the vicarage or the slaughterhouse. The other thing that you can do is to look back at the first page of each enumeration district, and that will tell you a little bit about the place. And that can be very useful, particularly if you're trying to do a bit of local history as well as family history. And if you're doing family history, you probably should be doing a bit of local history too, once you know where your ancestors came from. Another useful thing about the census, I've already said that 1911 is a really wonderful census, and it is, but 1851 is also very important, because it was the first one that gave exact birthplaces, or something like an exact birthplace. It does depend on the person filling in the information. They may not have known all that information. But it does give you a county and a parish of birth. And this is incredibly useful because before 1837, there was no civil registration in England and Wales. So to find out more, to research further back, you're really relying on parish registers for the most part. And a birthplace, a county and a parish of birth, will give you a really good start. It will tell you where you could go and look for the parish records for your ancestors. So that's a very, very brief overview of what you might expect to find in the census, whether it's the first time you've looked or whether you've been searching before and you feel inspired to go back again. But of course, it's not all good news. Sometimes you won't find everything that you're looking for. Sometimes the information might be wrong. For example, the head of the household, if they were a pub landlord, they might not know all the details about all the people who stayed in their pub that night. Someone who was the head of an institution, like a workhouse or an army barracks, might not have all that information and might not be all that bothered about writing it down accurately. I'm sure a lot of people thought, oh, this government form, I better get it filled in, and oh, this is good enough. I don't suppose anybody will ever want to look at it again. Little did they know. Sometimes you won't find people simply because the handwriting is so bad, it's very difficult to interpret, or because the enumerator may have lovely handwriting, but you don't know what they are copying from. It may have been something absolutely terrible, and they had to make their best guess at what somebody had meant to say when they wrote the information down. Sometimes, unfortunately, the bit of census that somebody's recorded in may be completely missing. Over the years, it has happened. There are damaged pages, there are lost pages, and sometimes whole districts are missing. As a proportion, it's very, very small, but of course, if your ancestor's in the bit that's missing, that's a 100% failure rate. So that's why I always advise people to see if you can find your ancestors and their family in as many census years as possible, because you may be able to find them, find the information that you want, even if it's not in the first place you wanted to look. The other bonus is that sometimes you will find a family member living with them in one census year and not in another, perhaps a grandparent, or maybe a family member who just happens to be visiting over census night. So it always pays to look a little bit wider than just searching for one person in one census. Well, I hope that's helped you a little bit, whether you're new to looking at the census or whether you've already looked and maybe you want to go back and have another look. We have got quite a lot more information on the National Archives website. We have a lot of research guides under help with your research. And the most popular of those guides in the family history category is a fairly long detailed guide about the census. And that gives you a lot more tips and hints about how to search the census and some of the pitfalls that you might come across when you're doing it. So good luck with your research, and I hope you enjoy looking in the census and get as much out of it as I have done over the years. Thank you.